also soon be able to create posts and things like that. So let's go ahead and get started. So in a previous video, we created our database and saw how we could manually create some users and posts, but now let's add that same logic to our application to create these users through the registration form. Now, before we create our users, we're going to need a way to hash our passwords. So in the previous video, we were using plain text passwords for our examples, but you never want to do this with your actual website, because if anyone was to ever get access to your database, then they would have the logins for all of your users, and that's definitely not a good thing. So there are several different hashing algorithms, but one good one that we can use is called bcrypt, and there's an extension for Flask that makes this easy to use, and that is called flask-bcrypt. So let's pull up our command line and install this with pip. So I have my virtual environment activated and I'm here in my project directory, and I'm going to install this just by saying pip install, and this is flask-bcrypt. So let's install that. And once that is installed, I'm going to clear my screen here. And now let's open up Python from our command line and see how this works. So I'm going to import the bcrypt class from that Flask extension. So I'll say from flask_bcrypt import this bcrypt class. And now we'll create an instance of that class. We'll say bcrypt is equal to this class and put in those parentheses there. And now let's hash a password. So we can say bcrypt, and we can use the generate password hash method and then pass in a password. And I'll just pass in a password of testing for now. And we can see that this created a password hash. And this B here at the beginning means that this is in bytes. Now on the extensions documentation page, they say if you want a string, then you can simply decode this to UTF-8. So if I rerun that password hash and do a decode of UTF-8, then now we can see that we get a similar hash, but there is no longer the B at the beginning there, so that's just a regular string. Okay, so one thing to notice here is that each time I run this, I get a different hash, even when using the same password. So if I do this again, then this hash is different than the one before, and if I do it again, then it's completely different than the one before. So this means that if someone was to steal this from your database, then they wouldn't even be able to use a hash table to crack these passwords. So if it's a different hash every time, then how can we verify if the user enters the correct password? If we just hash their entered password and can compare it to what we have stored in the database, then those will most likely be different. So we need to use another method called check password hash in order to check if those passwords are equal. So I'm going to save this hash password as a variable. So I'll rerun this again, and I'll just say that this is our hashed password. And remember, the password that we used there was this string of testing. So now let me clear this out so we have some more room here. And now let's check a few passwords against this hash password. So if I say bcrypt.check password hash, then first we want to pass in the hashed password. So I'll pass in that hashed password. And now let's compare this against a password of password. So this should return false since our hash password was originally testing. So we can see that we did get a false value there. But if I pass in testing and check that, then that gives us a true. So that is how we are going to hash and verify passwords. So let's add this to our application initialization. So I will exit out of this and clear my terminal. And now let's open up our project. And I am within my package init.py file here where we are initializing our application. And now to initialize this, it's going to be pretty similar to SQL Alchemy here. So we'll just say from flask-bcrypt import that bcrypt class, and then down here at the bottom we will say bcrypt is equal to bcrypt, and we want to pass in that app to that bcrypt class to initialize that. Okay, so now let's open up our routes and see what our current registration logic is. So if I go to the routes and go to our registration route here, and I'm going to make this text a little larger so we can see better here. Okay, so right now we are checking if this form is valid on submit. And if it is, then we flash a message that an account has been created for the user, but we aren't currently creating that account. So let's do that. So if the form is valid on submit, then first let's hash the password that they entered so that it's ready for us to save it to the database. So first we need to import bcrypt and the DB variables. And remember, if we're importing from our package, then it's going to import it from that init.py file. But we can just simply write that as if we're importing from the package itself. So we're already importing this app from that package. So now we need to also import the DB and our bcrypt. Okay, so now let's go back down to our registration route and inside of our validate on submit conditional here. And this will basically be the same thing that we just saw a second ago in the command line. So I will say hashed password is equal to bcrypt dot generate hashed, well, actually that is generate password hash, and then we want to pass in the password that we want to hash, and this is going to be whatever they insert into the password field. So that is form.password.data. And now remember, if we want this to be a string instead of bytes, then we can do a .decode of UTF-8. And I'm going to close the sidebar here so that we can see more of this line. Okay, so now that we have a hashed password, now we can create a new instance of a user. And we saw how to do this in a previous video. So we can do this just by going to the next line and creating a new user. So I'll say user is equal to user. And now we have to pass in all of the fields. So we want the username of this user to be equal to the information that they passed into the username field. So I'll do username data. And now we want to set the email of this user equal to form.email.data. And then we can set the password for this user. And that password is going to be equal to our hashed password. We don't want to pass in the data that they passed to the form because that will be the plain text password. We want the hashed version of that. Okay, so once we have that user created, then we can go to the next line here and add this user to the changes that we want to make to our database. So we can do this by saying db.session.add and then adding that user. And now we also want to commit those changes. It's only one change. So we can say db.session.commit. Okay, so that will add the user to the database. Now let's flash them a message telling them that their account has been created and that they can now log in. So instead of the message that we currently have here, I am instead going to pass in a message that just says, your account has been created. You are now able to log in. And again, we'll keep that success category there because that is the Bootstrap class. And now instead of returning them to the home route, let's return them to the login route so that they can log in with that newly created account. Okay, so now let's see if this part worked. So let's start up our website. So I'll bring up our terminal here, our command line, and I'll run this application just like we've seen before with python run.py. So our server is running. We didn't get any errors. So I will open this up. Okay, and the website looks good. So now if I go to the registration page, so if I click sign up with nothing there, we can see that the validation is still working, so that's good. And now let me just create a dummy user here. So Corey MS and Corey M. Schaefer at gmail.com, and the password I'll just put in as testing. So let's sign up. Okay, so with valid form information, we can see that we now got redirected to the login page with our flashed message telling us that we can now log in. Now, our logins still aren't working, but it looks like our user was added to the database. But let's make sure of that though. So I'm going to bring up my command line and stop our site from running. So I will kill that with Control-C. Now I'm going to clear this and I'll start up Python and import our database user model. So I will say from flask-blog import db, and we also want to import our user model. So we'll say from flask-blog.models import user. And now let's grab the first user out of this table. So I'll say user is equal to user.query.first. And we saw how to do this in a previous video. So if you haven't watched our database video, then you might want to watch that to understand what these queries are doing. Okay, so now let's print out that user, and we can see that we got a user with the username of Corey MS, the email of CoreyMSchaefer@gmail.com, and our default.jpg profile picture. So now let's look at the password for this user. So if I say user.password, then we can see that we do get a hashed version of a password, and that's exactly what we wanted. Okay, so that's good. But if we go back to our application, then there's actually something wrong with how we have this right now that might not be obvious right off the bat. So currently, our registration form will validate against things like bad emails and empty fields, but there's nothing stopping a user from trying to sign up with a username or email that already exists in our database. Now, we have a restriction set on our database models that say that those have to be unique, but that won't be caught or throw an error until we try to add that new user to the database. So let's see what this looks like if we were to try to add another user or email that currently already exists. So let's start up the website again. So I will go back here and close out of the Python interpreter and rerun our application. And now let's go back to our application and go to the registration route. And now I'm just going to try to sign up with the same credentials that I used before. So that was Corey MS and CoreyMSchaefer@gmail.com with password here and sign up. And you can see that we get this ugly error screen where it says that we had an SQL Alchemy integrity error and that the unique constraint has failed. And it also prints out the stack trace here of all the code that led up to this error. Now, this is the first time that we've seen an error screen like this. This is what happens when Flask throws an error and you're running in debug mode. This information can be extremely useful for debugging problems in your application, but this is also why you don't want to be, why you want to be absolutely sure that you're never running in debug mode when you deploy your website publicly, because this is just too much information to expose to other people. You can actually come to the bottom of this stack trace and run Python code to dig further into the problem. And you need the debugger pin from your console to do this, but it's still risky having that capability. So for example, if I wanted to debug this line here where we did the db.session.commit, then I could just click on that line or click on the option over here to the right where it says to run code here. So if I click on that, then it'll ask for the debugger pin. And if I pull up our terminal and scroll up here a bit when we first started our server, we can see that it has a debugger pin here. So I'll copy that and paste that into our debugger on the site. And now we can actually run Python code here within the browser to see the context of what the variables were at this point in the application. So if I was to print out user, then we can see what our user variable was at that point. So user.email. So we can see that we can get information back. So again, that can be useful to debug certain problems, but it's also why you don't want to be in debug mode when you're in production. Okay, so now we need to catch the failure that we saw here before we get to this ugly error screen. Now you might think that it's best to go into our register route here and to add in some database checks after our form is validated to see if the username or email already exists in our database. And that would be one way to do it, but I think that the best way to do this would be to add our own custom validation for the register form. That way it gets checked when we actually try to validate the form, and will return the visual feedback of the error messages like we've seen before. So how do we do this? Now, I got this from the WT form documentation. So if we open up our forms file, so I'll open up my sidebar here and open up our forms module. To do this, we want to come inside of our registration form here and go down. And now we can create a custom validation simply by creating a function within this form. So I'll type this out and we can go over it. So this is going to say, this is going to be a function of validate field, and take self and field as arguments there. Then we'll say if true, raise validation error. And we're also going to want a error validation message. So validation message. Okay, so what I just created here is basically a template for our validation methods. So they're going to be in this format. So validate, and then we're going to put the field name here that we want to validate, and then also pass in the field name here as an argument. And then we're going to have some kind of conditional. So this just says if true for now, but we'll add in some type of conditional. And if it meets that condition, then we can raise a validation error with a validation message. And I think this will be more clear once we customize this to our needs. So let's do that now. So we want to validate the username field. So we can change this field name to be username. And we also change that argument to username there. And the condition that we want to check is whether or not the user already exists in the database. So first we need to import the user model from our models. So from the top here, I will say from flask-log.models import user, and now go back to our conditional. And now we can query whether the username being submitted to the form is already in our database by saying above the conditional here, we'll say user is equal to user.query.filter by, and we want to filter by if this username is already in the database. We'll say username is equal to username.data. Now this is what's coming from the form. That's what this argument is here. And then we'll just get the first value back from the database. So if there is a value, then we'll get the first one there. If there isn't a user, then that's just going to return none. And now we can change our conditional to something that we want to throw a validation error. So if this user exists already, then we want to throw the validation error. So I'll get rid of these empty spaces here. So we'll just say if user, then we want to raise the validation error. So basically, if user is none, then it won't hit this conditional. But if user is anything other than none, then it will throw this validation error. Now, the validation message is what gets sent back to the form. So we want to be more specific so that the user knows what actually went wrong. So we want to say that username is taken. Please choose a different one. And lowercase c there. Looks a little weird. Okay, so that should be good for our username validation. Oh, actually, there is one more thing. We haven't actually imported this validation error yet, so that needs to be done as well. And that is part of the WT Forms validators. So we can just add that to the import there. So from wtforms.validators, add that validation error there onto the import. Okay, so that should give us a validation error if the username is already taken. Now we want the email to be unique too. So let's make another custom validator for the email, and we can simply copy and paste this one since it will be so similar. And I will paste this in right below here. And now we need to change out the field names here. So we can say that we want this to be validate email, and also change the argument that we're passing in there. So the email parameter is what we want. And now for this, we want to make sure that the email doesn't exist in our database. So instead of username equaling username.data, we want this to be email equals email.data. And so the conditional will be the same. So if a user exists with that email, then we want to throw a validation error. And our message will just say that email is taken, please choose a different one. So we'll save that. Okay, and simply by adding those custom validators, that should solve our problem and catch that before we see that ugly error that we saw before. So let's go back and reload our page. So, okay, it looks like our website is still running, so that's good. So I'll go back to our register form. So we're still on that ugly page there. And now let me try to fill out our form with a username and email that is already in the system. So we will fill this out and sign up. And we can see that we got validation errors for both of those. This one says that the username is currently taken, please choose a different one. This says that the email is taken and to please choose a different one. So those are working, and we were able to query our database and tell the user that this username or email was already taken and that they'll need to choose something different. Okay, so now we have a pretty good registration system. Now we need to create a login system so that our users that have created accounts can log in and log out. Now to do this, we're going to be using another Flask extension, and this extension is called flask-login, and it makes it really easy to manage user sessions. So first, let's install that by using pip. So I'm going to open our command line here, and I'm going to shut down the server by hitting Control-C and clearing this out. And we can install this just by saying pip install flask-login. And once we have that installed, I'll clear the screen here. And now let's add this to our initialization of our application like we've done with our other extensions. So I'll open up our code here and go to our init.py file within our package. And just like our other extensions, we can import this and then initialize it. So the class that we want to import from this extension will be, so from Flask login, we want to import the class login manager. And now we can create an instance of that. So I'll save that there. And down below our other extensions, I will say login manager is equal to login manager, and I'll pass in the app into that class. Okay, so now we're ready to use this login manager in our application. So the way that this works is that we add some functionality to our database models, and then it will handle all of the sessions in the background for us. So let's open up our database model. So I'll open up this models.py file here. And first of all, we need to import our login manager from our package, and that comes from the same place as our DB instance. So we can just add that to our import. So I will add the login manager to our imports there from our FlashBlog package. And now we need to create a function with a decorator called user loader. And this is for reloading the user from the user ID stored in the session. And I simply grabbed this from their documentation on the extension's website. So it's not like I've memorized this. It's just one thing that you need to put in place for the extension to work, because the extension has to know how to find one of your users by ID. So first, let's create this decorated function. So we can create a function called load user that takes a user ID as an argument. So I'll do that now. So load user that takes a user ID as our argument. And then we can return the user for that ID. And if you remember from a couple of videos ago, we can do this with the query.get method. So I'll say return user.query.get, and we want to get the user with that ID. And let's cast that to an integer just to be sure. So we will pass in this user ID here and save that. And now let's decorate this function so that the extension knows that this is the function to get a user by an ID. And we have to use this naming convention. So we will say, so we'll put the @ to specify a decorator. And this is going to be login manager dot user underscore loader. Okay, so we've almost got this extension set up, but there's one more thing that we have to do. So the extension will expect your user model to have certain attributes and methods. It's going to expect 4 to be exact. One is called isAuthenticated, which will return true if they've provided valid credentials. Another is called isActive. Another is called isAnonymous. And the last one is a method called getID. Now we could add all of these ourselves, but this is so common that the extension provides us with a simple class that we can inherit from that will add all of these required attributes and methods for us. So we can simply import this class from Flask login, and this class is called user mixin. So I'll say from Flask underscore login import user mixin, and spell that correctly and save that. And then in our user model, we can simply import from this user mixin class. So I will just pass that in as a class that we inherit from. Now be sure that you're still inheriting from both DB model and user mixin. You don't want to overwrite the DB model. Okay, so that should be all we need to do with our extension in order for it to manage our sessions for us. So now let's modify the login route so that we can see how this works. So let's pull up our routes again and go to our login route. So before, we were simply checking a hard-coded username and password here. But now we're going to be actually checking our database if the username and password is valid. So I'm going to delete what we have within our form.validate on submit conditional here, and I'm only going to leave this flash login unsuccessful part. So I'll get rid of the current conditionals that we have. And now let's put in our logic for logging in a user. So first of all, they'll be logging in with their email. So let's query our database to make sure that the user exists. So I can say user is equal to user.query.filter by, spell that right. And we want to check if their email is equal to form.email.data. So the data that the user entered into the email form, we want to filter if there are any emails in our database with that same email address. And if so, we just want to get the first user back with that email. And if there isn't one, then it will just return none. And now I'm going to create a conditional that simultaneously checks that the user exists and that their password verifies with what they have in the database. So I will say if user, which will make sure that the user that we just filtered by exists, and bcrypt.check password hash. And now we want to compare their database password with the password that they entered into the form. So first we pass in the hash password to this check password hash method. So we can just pass in user.password, and that'll be what comes from the database, since this is the database query here. And the second value is the password that they entered into the form. So form.password.data, and save that. Now we also need the colon here at the end of our conditional. So if the user exists and the password that they entered is valid with what's in the database, then we want to log that user in. So to log them in using our flask-login extension, we need to import the login user function. So I'll go up here to the top, and we can simply say from flask_login import. We want to import this login user function. So let's copy this, go back down to our conditional, and now we'll simply use this function to log the user in. So we can paste this in here, and we want to log in this user. And also remember that we have a remember me form, and this login user function takes a remember argument as well. So we can just say remember is equal to form.remember.data. And that's just going to be a true false value. If they check it, then that'll be true. If it's unchecked, it'll be false. Okay, so that will log in the user, and after they're logged in, let's now redirect them to the home page. So we'll just say return redirect, which we've seen before, URL for, and we want the URL for the homepage. Okay, and if they submitted the form and it doesn't meet our conditional here of being a valid email or password, then let's just keep this flashed message here from before that says that the login is unsuccessful, and to check the username and password. And I actually just realized that we're not logging in by username, we're logging in by email. So that should be check email and password. So if we don't hit this conditional here, then we just want to flash this message. So we'll put in an else and then indent that flash message into the else block there. So if it wasn't a successful login, then they'll never hit this return statement here, and they'll just end up down here at the bottom where we're simply returning the login page. Okay, so let's try this out. So let's bring up the site in the browser, and I'll try to log in with the user that we created just a bit ago. So if we check, our server is not running, so I will run that and then pull up the site in the browser. And now let's go to the login page. And first, let me give it some bad credentials. So I'll just say c@demo.com and pass in a random password. So we can see that if I log in with a bad email or password, then we can see that we just get kicked back to the login page with our flashed message that says login unsuccessful, please check email and password. Okay, so now let me log in with the password that I chose, with the username and password that I chose before. So I'll do CoreyMSchaefer@gmail.com and that password of testing. So let's log in. So we can see that when I put in the email and password that's actually in the database, then I get redirected to the homepage. That seemed to have worked. Okay, so that's good. So we're actually logging in users who exist in our database. Now there's only a couple of other things that we need to set up here, and we'll be finished up with this part. So one thing that's a little strange here is that we're logged in, but we can still see our login and register routes in our navigation bar. So if we click on one of those routes, then we can see that we can get back to the login page, even though we're already logged in. So really, if the user is already logged in and they try to go to the login or register page, then we should probably just redirect them back to the home page, because they don't need to be on those pages if they're already logged into their account. So in order to tell if the user is currently logged in, then we can use the current user variable from the flask-login extension. So let's go back to our routes and import that. So I will open up our routes, go up to the top of our import here, and where we're importing from this flask-login, let's also import current_user. And now at the top of both of our login and register routes, so I'll do the register route first. At the very top here, I will just say if the current user is authenticated, then we want to return a redirect for the homepage. So I will do a redirect URL for, and we will send them back to the homepage. And I will just copy this and paste this into the top of the login route as well. So now let's see what happens when we try to go to the login or register page if we're already logged in. So our web server is still running. So now if I go to the home page and then try to go back to the login page, then we can see we just get redirected to this home page. If I click on the register page, then again, we just get redirected back to the home page. So that's good. That conditional and that redirect that we put in there is working. Now it's a little strange that we even see those links in our navigation if we're logged in. Most websites will replace those with a logout link if you're logged in. So let's create a logout route to log out our user, and then we'll display in our navigation when the user is logged in a logout route. So to do this, I will go back to our routes and go to the bottom here, and now we'll create a logout route, and this is going to be pretty short. So I'm going to just grab another route as a starting point here and get rid of these methods. We don't want posts to this route, and I will call this route logout. And just like we used the login user function to log the user in, we're going to need to use the logout user function to log the user out. So first let's import that. So at the very top here where we imported login user, let's also import logout user and go back down to our logout route. And now within this route, we can simply just log the user out. And this doesn't take any arguments because it already knows what user is logged in. So we can just say logout _user and run that function. And once the user is logged out, let's redirect them back to the home page. So I will just grab the redirect link for the home page here and paste that in below our logout user. Okay, and we also want to actually see this logout link in the navigation if the user is logged in. So in this case, we'll have to change our layout template where the navigation is created. So I will open up our templates folder here and open up our layout template where those navigation links are, which are right here. Here are the login and register routes. So right where we're creating these two anchor tags for our login and register routes, I'm going to put in a Jinja2 conditional and use that same current user.isAuthenticated check that we used before. So I will open up some code blocks here with some curly braces and %signs, and then we can say if current_user.isAuthenticated, then that means that the user is logged in and we want to add the logout route. And we'll do that in just a second. But for now, I'm going to put in our else block. And in the else block, if they are not authenticated, then we want to show the login and register routes. So I will indent those into that code block. And now we need to close out this if statement. So curly braces and %signs and end if. Okay, so now let's copy one of these links here and paste this into the is authenticated section. And this is where we want to display the logout route. So I will change the URL for from login to logout. and change the text from login to log out. Okay, so now let's save this and let's test all of this out. So if we open up the terminal, then we had an error for a second there whenever I saved. So let's rerun our server, make sure we're not getting any errors. Okay, so our server is running. If I pull up our page here, then I'm already logged in. And whenever I reloaded the page, we can see that now we get this logout link. So let me click on that logout link. And as soon as I did, we can see that these changed to log in and register. So that seems to be logging me in and logging me out. And let's just make sure that that login functionality still works as well. So I will type in the credentials of the user I created. Yep, and we can see that now the logout link is displayed in the top right. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to be learning in this video is how to put a restriction on certain routes so that you can only go to those routes if you are logged in. So you'll see this on certain sites all the time. So say that I click on a link to edit my Twitter profile or something like that. If I'm not logged in, then it will take me to the login page and say, hey, you have to log in first before you can view this page. So let's do something like this on our site. So let's create a route for the user's account that they can access after they've logged in. So first we have to create this route. So I will open our project back up and open up our routes.py file and go down to add another route here. And now I'll create an account route. So I'll copy this section here and paste this in. And instead of logout, we want this to be account. Be sure that you change the function name as well. And we're also going to need a template for this route. So we'll create a template called account.html, and we'll create that template right now. But first, let's go ahead and return the template for our route that we're about to create. So I'm just going to copy where we are returning a template up here and then paste this in and modify it. So we want to return an account.html template that we're going to create in just a second, and the title of that page will be account. Okay, and now let's create that template. So within our templates directory, I will create a new file, and I will call this account.html. Now I want a starting point for this template, so I'm just going to open up our about template and copy this code here where we're extending from our layout and opening our block content section, and I'll paste that into our account template. But within our content section of our account template, we'll make this super simple for now and just display the current user's username. So in this H1 tag here, instead of saying about page, I am going to use these double curly braces and print out the current user.username. And now let's add a link to this route within our navigation if the user is logged in. And our navigation is located in our layout template. We just saw this. So this is going to be visible if the user is logged in. So right above our logout link, we will copy that and we will paste in this account link. So instead of logout, I'll say account. And the URL here is going to be the URL for account. So I'll save that. So now if we check if our server is still running, we need to restart that. So I will do that now. So restart our server. And now if we go back to our page, we can see that now we have this account link here in our navigation. And if we click on this account link, then we can see that it displays the current logged in user's username. But if we go back and log out and then try to go to this account page, then we can see that we don't get anything on this screen. And we don't get anything on this screen because it doesn't have a current user and doesn't know what username to display. So we want to put a check in place that makes a user log in before they can access this account page. So to do that, this is extremely easy to do. We can use the login required decorator from the flask-login extension. So if we go back to our routes, so I open up our routes file, let's go up here to our imports. And from our flask-login extension, we want to add another import here. And this is going to be login_required. Okay, and now I'm going to copy this login required here. And now we can simply add this decorator to our account route. So if I go down to our account route here at the bottom, then I'm going to simply add another decorator here. And that decorator is going to be this login required that we just imported. So now our extension knows that we need to log in to access that route, but we also need to tell the extension where our login route is located. So to do this, we need to go back to our init.py file where we first initialized this application. And right under where we created our instance of the login manager, we can set the login route by saying login manager dot login view and set that equal to our login view. And this will just be login. And the view that we pass in here is the function name of our route. So it's the same thing that we would pass into the URL for function. Okay, so now let's try this again in our browser. So I have saved all of these files that we've changed. So I'll pull up our terminal and our web server is still running, so that's good. Pull up our site and go back to our home page. So now I'm not currently logged in, so we can't see the account link up here, but I can still type that in manually and go to that route. And if I type that in, then we can see that it redirects us to our logout or login route, and it says please log in to access this page. So now if I was to log in with the account I've been using and then submit that, then it sends us back to the home page. And now if I try to access that account page again, then we can see that we do access that account route and it displays the current user's username. Okay, so there are just two more things that I'd like to do to clean this up a bit. So first of all, the flashed message telling us to log in was pretty ugly. You may have noticed that. In our video so far, we've been using the flash categories to add a class to those flashed alerts. Now to do this within the login message, then we can go back to our init file here. And then we can just add another line here. So I'm going to copy what we have here. And this is just going to be login manager dot login underscore message underscore category. And now we're going to set that equal to the category that we want that to be, which in our case is what we're using for the Bootstrap classes. So I'm just going to set this equal to info for the info class, which in Bootstrap is just this nicely colored blue information alert. Okay, now the last thing that I want to do to improve this is when we tried to access the account page and we were logged out, it directed us to the login, which is good. But after we logged in, it first redirected us back to the home page and we had to access the account page from there. So it would be nice if it would just redirect us back to the page that we were trying to access before it told us that we had to log in. And this is easy to do as well. Now, I don't know if you noticed this, but when we tried to access the account page and it directed us to the login first, it added a query parameter to the URL of the page that we were trying to access. So let me show what this looked like. So our server is still running, so that's good. So let me log out and then try to access this account page. So first of all, we can see that our flashed message looks better now with that info style. But also, if we look here in the URL, then we have a query parameter here called next, and it is equal to the route that we were trying to log into before we got redirected. So in our login route, let's access that query parameter, and if it exists, then we will direct the user there after they log in. So I'm going to open up our routes here, and let's see, open up our routes.py file and go to our login route. And actually, first thing, we're going to be accessing query parameters, and we will need to import the request object from Flask. So first, let's go to the top and import that. And this is going to be from Flask. So we've already got some imports from Flask here. So I'm just going to add onto this, and I will import this request object here, and then go back down to our login route. So now we want to get this after the user logs in. So this login user line here is where we logged in the user. So then we can get the next parameter from the URL if it exists by saying something like next page is equal to request.args.get, and we want to get that next parameter. Now args is a dictionary, but you don't want to access next using the square brackets and key name, because that would throw an error if the key doesn't exist. And the next parameter is going to be optional. So if we use the get method, then it will simply return none if the next key doesn't exist. So be sure that you are using the get method and not the square brackets with the key like you might be used to. So now if that next parameter exists, the next page will be equal to that route. But if it doesn't exist, the next page is going to be none. So now in the return statement, we can do something like this. So I will say return redirect, and I'll do a redirect to that next page route if next page, which basically means if it is not none. And then we can put in an else here and say else redirect for the URL for home. Now, some of you might not be familiar with this in Python, but this is called a ternary conditional. Basically, we're just saying redirect to the next page if next page exists, but if it is none or false, then just return the redirect to this home page. Okay, so that should do it for our changes. So now let's be sure that we save all of these changes and then pull up our browser. So first I'll check my terminal, and we have to restart our web server here and pull up our browser. Okay, so now we are currently logged out. So if we try to access our account page, then it should redirect us to the login page, which it did. And now if we log in with the account that I created before, then we can see that when we log in, it redirected us to the account page. So that's good. That's what we wanted. Now, we also probably want to make sure that it still directs us to the home page if the next parameter doesn't exist in the URL. So let's log out and simply go to the login page. And since we went there directly, this next parameter doesn't exist in the URL because we didn't try to access a page that required a login. So now let's log in again. And we can see that that logs us in and directs us to the home page. So all of that seems to be working well. Okay, so I think that is going to do it for this video. I hope that now you have a good idea for how you can implement an authorization system like this on your website. And in the next video, we'll update the user account page and make it so that users can update their information and also add an image for their profile picture. But if anyone has any questions about what we covered in this video, then feel free to ask in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to answer those. And if you enjoy these tutorials and would like to support them, then there are several ways you can do that. The easiest way is to simply like the video and give it a thumbs up. And also, it's a huge help to share these videos with anyone who you think would find them useful. And if you have the means, you can contribute through Patreon, and there's a link to that page in the description section below. Be sure to subscribe for future videos, and thank you all for watching.